Dear friends, the Great Pyramids are the most mysterious structures on the planet. Everything about them is unusual, from their enormous size and strange layout of the interior to the smallest details. Professional scientists and Egyptology enthusiasts around the world have been trying to solve this puzzle for a long time. A huge number of hypotheses and assumptions are put forward, but for now, the mystery of the Egyptian pyramids remains unsolved. But is it possible to imagine that most of these patterns and strange features are explained by one very simple reason? That there is one universal key to understanding the vast majority of the pyramid's mysteries. That, in fact, there is one universal answer to almost all questions. That all these seemingly unrelated details are actually parts of one whole. Does this seem incredible? Let's try to figure it out. The builders of the Egyptian pyramids faced many difficult tasks. And one of the main challenges for them, of course, was the need to lift a huge number of blocks high up. The height of the Maidum Pyramid is 93 meters. The bent and red pyramids are more than 100 meters high, and the Kufu Pyramid is almost 147 meters. Considering that the weight of the building material was measured in millions of tons, it is difficult to overestimate the scale of the work done to lift the blocks. How could all this be done? As I said in previous videos, I'm sure that there is only one way to do this, using a counterweight. But this counterweight had to constantly return back, because in order to lower it, you first have to raise it up. And the ancient builders had only one counterweight at their disposal that could rise back up by itself: people. And understanding this important idea is the first step on our way to solving the mystery of how the Egyptian pyramids were built. But for now, we need to figure out the easiest way to start construction. To do this, we need a ramp to lift the blocks up and a large pit at the bottom to give the counterweight enough range of motion. Since we decided to use people as a counterweight, there must be an exit from this pit to the top. I hope you understand what I'm getting at. Yes, I want to say that these huge pits that we see in Abu Rawash and Zawiyat el-Aryan were needed not only to build a chamber with a sarcophagus there. They were directly involved in the construction process. Platforms with a counterweight, which was people, were lowered into them, and these people then walked up the ramp. In the pit in Zawiyat el-Aryan, they even made steps for them. That is why these pits are in the center of the pyramids. That is why these pits are so big and deep. And that is why their size depends on the size of the pyramids. The larger the pyramid, the larger the pit. At the beginning of construction, ramps approached the pit from two sides, and during the construction of large pyramids, possibly from four sides. And several platforms along the perimeter of the pit were used at the same time, which allowed for the acceleration of the creation of the lower part of the pyramid, which contained the most blocks. And this assumption immediately explains another very strange fact. It becomes clear why it was necessary to level the walls of these pits like that. After all, we know from the reports of John Perring and Flinders Petrie that the pit in Abu Rawash was even lined with limestone slabs. If these pits were intended only to build chambers in them and then fill them with blocks, then this is absolutely senseless. But if we imagine that platforms with people were descending into them, then these platforms could, during possible swinging, catch on the unevenness of the wall with a sad outcome for the living counterweight. Therefore, leveling the walls of the pit looks extremely rational. So, with the help of the pit, we can lift the blocks in the center of the pyramid. But this is clearly not enough. How do we get them there if the level of the main masonry has already risen to a certain height? That is, we somehow need to lift them at the foot of the pyramid and then move them to the center. Of course, we will do this using another system with a counterweight. For this, we need two more planes. We already have one, this is the built face of the pyramid. But where can we get the second one? Let's continue the ramp coming from the pit. Thus, we solve two problems at once. Firstly, now the workers from below can reach the current level of the masonry. And secondly, we have a ramp along which we can lower the counterweight to lift the load along the side face. I believe that a similar system was created on the other side of the pyramid. After all, at the beginning of construction, the main working side of the pit was the southern side opposite the entrance. Most likely, this is why quarries were usually located on the southern side of the pyramids. This allowed for faster delivery of blocks for the lower part of the pyramid. And also on this ramp coming from the pit, it is possible to build an inclined corridor. These descending corridors are the true calling card of the Great Pyramids. There is nothing like it anywhere else. Egyptologists explain the presence of these corridors by religious reasons, and their accuracy by the perfectionism of the builders. Allegedly, the water of creation flowed along these corridors, carrying the soul of the pharaoh to the stars. But I think their slope and accuracy are explained by the fact that they are built on descending ramps. And in the last video, I already gave a fact confirming this. Do you see this layer of Tura limestone on the ramp in the Abu Rawash pit? The edge of exactly the same layer is visible at the entrance to the descending corridor of the Kufu Pyramid. That is, there is no doubt about the presence of the same ramp there. I am sure that the other corridors were built using a similar technological method. Thus, we understood how the level of the masonry can be brought to the top of the descending ramp. And then the upper ramps going to the center can be built up until their length is equal to the depth of the pit. Most likely, it is precisely for the convenient location of this second ramp that the descending ramp in both Abu Rawash and Zawiyat el-Aryan is shifted to the side and does not descend to the center of the pit. I am sure that this was the basic principle of construction, lifting blocks with the help of a counterweight, which is people, using inclined ramps and pits. And this very simple principle is the main key to understanding most of the secrets of the Egyptian pyramids. Let's see how this idea appeared and how it was transformed from pyramid to pyramid. The first of the Egyptian pyramids, the step pyramid of Djoser in Saqqara, built by the famous Imhotep. This pyramid was apparently built in several stages, the first of which was a small mastaba. Under this mastaba, there is a huge shaft 30 meters deep, around which a whole system of tunnels with a total length of several kilometers has been dug. At the bottom of the shaft, there is a strange sarcophagus made of granite beams. The origin and purpose of this huge shaft are still being debated. Relatively recently, a version was even put forward that during construction it was used as a water elevator. But I believe it was much simpler, and that platforms with counterweights were lowered into this shaft. It is difficult to determine what specific route the builders took to lift the blocks up. Perhaps there were inclined ramps for each step, or perhaps they lifted the blocks along inclined layers. At the same time, when the pyramid was built up again to its current size, such a height of the shaft was already excessive, and most likely a reasonable length of the ropes no longer allowed the counterweight to be lowered to the bottom of the shaft. This explains another of the mysteries of this pyramid, namely, the presence of passages that come out in the middle of the shaft. Scientists cannot understand what they are for, but I think the answer is simple. They were needed so that people descending as a counterweight could, having stopped in the middle of the shaft, rise back up. And look at how these additional passages are located. They rise with a step that exactly corresponds to the height of the pyramid step. And this indirectly confirms the assumption we are considering. Thus, already in the very first pyramid, we see the use of the method of lifting building materials with the help of a counterweight. I think it was this technology that made it possible to build this first stone pyramid in ancient Egypt and made its creator, Imhotep, so famous. The next pyramid was the Pyramid of Pharaoh Sekhemkhet. Of its possible 7 stages, only the first was built to the end, and the second stage remained unfinished. If it had been completed, its height would have been about 77 meters. But whether it was supposed to complete all 7 stages or the builders initially intended to limit themselves to only 2 is not clear. Here is a diagram of the pyramid. On the side plan, you can clearly see a vertical shaft going from above into a descending corridor, cut into the rocky foundation under the pyramid. It is believed that such shafts were security elements. And this is reasonable, because if this shaft is filled with stones from above, then when robbers try to clear the corridor, the stones will constantly fall out from above. And in order to go further, they will have to take them all out, which in fact was done by Zakaria Gonim, who was the first to explore this pyramid. But perhaps Egyptologists still do not fully understand the functionality of this shaft. Let's look at another interesting object, Mastaba K1 in Beit Khalaf. It dates back to the same time as the Pyramid of Sekhemkhet. It is one of the largest mastabas of the 3rd dynasty. Its base measures 86 by 45 meters, and its height is about 10 meters. It is built of clay bricks. On the diagram of this mastaba, we see 5 vertical shafts. At the bottom of these shafts were found locking stones, the so-called portcullis. But were the builders so worried about the safety of the burial that they needed as many as 5 shafts for safety? Agree, it looks very strange. And the 2 central shafts, located practically next to each other, from this point of view, look absolutely meaningless. I think the purpose of these shafts was much more rational, and they were also used to lower the counterweight, and the people who acted as this counterweight returned up the inclined tunnel. Then the location of these shafts becomes clear. The shallow ones were used at the beginning of construction, and the central ones at the very end. Look, their height coincides with the length of the inclined ramp that would descend to the foot of the mastaba. Let's return to the Sekhemkhet pyramid. Note the level to which the vertical shaft went. This is the level of the 2nd stage, and it was at this stage that construction stopped. That is, it is quite possible that no more stages were planned. After all, there are no shafts that could go higher. We will not consider the last of the pyramids of the 3rd dynasty, the Pyramid of Kaaba. It is very small and also unfinished. The vertical shaft of this pyramid is located on the side. That is, most likely an external inclined ramp was used for its construction. And after this comes the key moment in pyramid building. The era of the Great Pyramids of the 4th dynasty begins. The first of the Great Pyramids was built at Meidum. It was a transitional phase from step pyramids to pyramids with smooth sides. 3 stages of construction are clearly visible in it: small step pyramid, large step pyramid, and 3rd stage with smooth side faces. Whether this 3rd stage was realized remains unclear at this point. Let's go back to the scheme proposed at the beginning. So at first, the blocks could be raised up with the help of a counterweight moving down an inclined ramp. The next ramp went back to the center. In order for the counterweight to have sufficient amplitude of movement, the rocky base below was pierced several meters down. But the main part of the pit was created directly in the masonry of the pyramid. I believe that in this way, the builders recreated the same huge shaft that was under the Djoser pyramid, but above ground level. And this very important innovation allowed to significantly increase the height of the pyramid. The resulting depth of the pit was just enough to move the counterweight. With the help of this simple technique, the builders were able to build the pyramid to about half the height. But what next? It is impossible to continue raising the level of the masonry, leaving a huge hole in the middle of the pyramid. But if this hole is completely filled with blocks, then there will be nowhere to lower the counterweight. The situation seems to be a dead end. And I think that for this seemingly insoluble problem, the ancient builders found a truly ingenious solution, which in many ways made the pyramids as we know them today. Filling the pit with blocks, they left a vertical shaft, at the bottom of which was a chamber. A platform with a counterweight was lowered down, and the workers on it returned up along an inclined corridor. That is, in fact, they repeated the technique used in the construction of the mastaba in Beit Khalaf and the Pyramid of Sekhemkhet. Only there the corridor was cut below the level of the base, and here it was created directly in the masonry of the pyramid. This allowed them to continue raising the level of the masonry, while retaining the main tool for lifting the blocks up. I believe that for such a solution, the so-called false vault was first introduced in the Maidum Pyramid. Its main feature is that it is composite, and unlike a true vault with a keystone in the middle, it can be used to cover the ceiling partially, not completely, and to finish the covering later when the shaft on top was filled with blocks on mortar. At the same time, the strange vertical tunnel leading into the chamber immediately receives a reasonable explanation. There was nothing like it before the Maidum Pyramid. Egyptologists explain its presence as a security measure. In their opinion, it made it difficult for robbers to get inside. Although it is absolutely obvious that a small staircase would be enough to cope with such a simple difficulty. And to build such a vertical tunnel just for this purpose was absolutely pointless. But within the framework of the theory under consideration, this rise has a much more rational meaning. Raising the level of the chamber made it possible to raise the blocks higher by building up an inclined ramp from above. It could have been implemented like this or like this. And note that this ramp ends exactly at the level of the fourth step. And at the next two levels, we see a strange trace on the side face. There are no such traces at the levels below. I think this is explained by the fact that up to the fourth level, the blocks were raised by moving the counterweight in the center of the pyramid. And then the counterweight, most likely, went from the outside right along the faces. Such an action damaged the already leveled surface, so it had to be leveled again, thereby obtaining a pressed trace on the face. As you can see, the idea of using a counterweight alone explains almost everything, including why the inner chamber in the Meidum Pyramid was first at surface level and not lowered down as in the previous pyramids. Why the Maidum Pyramid first had a straight, inclined corridor running right through the pyramid's masonry, and why it ends at the bottom with such a strange vertical section. But this was only the beginning of the fantastic rise of pyramid building. The next pyramid was the Bent Pyramid. It is 10 meters higher than the Maidum Pyramid. I believe that is why the builders decided to make two systems of chambers in it at once, the lower, or northern, and the upper, or western. The lower chamber is almost completely built underground. That is, it is built in a pit dug under the pyramid. And this was the first use of the technology of pits with ramps, which will later be used in Abu Rawash and Zawiyat El Aryan. At the same time, the upper chamber is at the level of the base. And I am absolutely sure that it is also made in an improvised pit built from blocks directly in the masonry of the pyramid. In my video about the construction of the Kufu Pyramid, I, in my opinion, very convincingly showed that the chambers in it were built in similar pits with ramps. This is indicated by many details of the masonry and the trajectory of the inclined channels. And then I assumed that the builders reproduced the shape of the pits that we see in Abu Rawash and Zawiyat El Aryan, since it was more convenient for them to work this way. But it turns out that this is not the main reason. As we have already understood, the pits allowed the blocks to be raised higher by moving the counterweight in them. And to increase the height of the pyramid, the builders decided to create several pits, placing them at different heights. That is why we see several chambers at once in large pyramids and only one chamber in small pyramids. This is not a matter of religious beliefs and the desire of the builders to make spare rooms in case of the early death of the pharaoh, as many Egyptologists assume. This feature was determined by the technology of building pyramids. Moreover, I think that in the Meidum, bent and red pyramids, whose chambers have a false vault on top, the builders worked with the pits in two stages. In the first stage, the pit was used open, and in the second stage it was filled with blocks. A chamber was built in it, and a vertical tunnel for a counterweight went from above to this chamber, and people descending into this chamber went back up along an inclined corridor. And if this assumption is correct, then the purpose of the incredible efforts that the builders spent on creating these corridors becomes clear. They were needed not only to carry the body of the pharaoh through them once. They took direct part in the creation of the pyramids, and during the construction, workers passed through them millions of times, returning to the top after descending into the chamber. And it is precisely in these three pyramids, attributed to the pharaoh Snefru, that we see the longest inclined corridors created in the masonry of the pyramid. And the bent pyramid provides very important confirmation of this idea. The fact is that both of its chambers have undergone very significant and strange transformations. In the lower chamber, on the wall, we see the remains of a mortar in the form of a staircase. There is no doubt that there were steps here. The pinkish color of this mortar indicates that it dates back to the time of the 4th dynasty. It is absolutely unclear to scientists why such a capital staircase could have been needed. After all, for finishing work, not to mention burying the body of the pharaoh, a wooden one would have been enough. You must agree that the presence of such a staircase only confirms our assumption that at the time of construction, a large number of people must have constantly passed here. If we continue the line of this staircase further, it will lead to the entrance to the so-called connecting corridor. This is a crooked tunnel connecting two systems of rooms, and on the one hand, it is obvious that it was not included in the original project, and on the other hand, it was made by someone who knew the pyramid plan very well, since it is simply impossible to connect these rooms so precisely without such information. But the strangest thing begins in the upper chamber. Its floor was raised, and not all at once, but in two stages. How thoroughly this was done is clearly visible in this photograph. Previously, a mound of stones led to the top of this additional structure, and on top of it, a flat floor was made. Moreover, when researchers dismantled it, trying to understand what was inside, they first discovered another lower floor level, and below it, a frame of logs. That is, there is no doubt that this structure was created in stages, and each of the stages was an independent project. In addition, a sloping ramp of stones was poured over the second floor, leading directly to the ceiling of the chamber, which, by the way, is as high as a 5-story building. Moreover, the false vault of this chamber was destroyed. The projections of the walls that used to form the ceiling were cut off. That is, the chamber was expanded first from below and then in the middle and upper parts in 2 or 3 stages. In this sketch, Franck Monnier showed an approximate sequence of transformations. And this destruction is clearly man-made. The projections of the false vault were cut off very carefully from below, and in the middle part, the workers even tried to maintain a right angle at the junction of the walls, although in this place they had to cut off a lot of material from each side. But who needed to do this? There is nothing like this in other pyramids. All these actions seem so senseless that researchers just shrug their shoulders. In this case, even their universal argument about religious expediency does not work. But our hypothesis about the presence of a vertical shaft on top of this chamber immediately explains all these details. The builders, trying to use it to the maximum, raised the pulley attachment point from above, and the platform with people stopped reaching the floor of the chamber. When they raised the floor level the first time, the chamber was still wide enough, and then the narrowing walls stopped allowing people to get off the platform. They had to cut off the blocks of the false vault. Then this operation was repeated once more, and only at the end of construction, the builders covered the chamber from above as best they could. But there was no trace left of the beauty of the false vault that we see in the lower chamber. And when the construction was already at the final stage and the outer casing of the pyramid had already been laid, it became inconvenient to exit through the upper inclined corridor. After all, the exit from it is at a height of more than 30 meters. Therefore, a connecting tunnel was cut through, and a reliable staircase was already built in the lower chamber, allowing a large flow of people to pass. In the bent pyramid, due to the complexity of the two systems of internal rooms and, apparently, the changing plan during construction, which led to such large-scale alterations of the upper chamber, I cannot yet determine the configuration of the upper ramps that the builders used during its construction. However, in the next pyramid, this task was accomplished quite quickly. In the red pyramid, the creators returned to the idea of one corridor, but this corridor leads to 3 chambers at once, one of which is raised high above the other 2. In the corridor leading to this chamber, there is also a detail that confirms our assumption about the passage of a large number of people. The floor blocks in it are cut down to increase the height of the passage. It is unlikely that such a solution would have been needed for the passage of robbers. In addition, no one except builders would have cut these blocks so carefully. In this pyramid, it is quite easy to determine the configuration of the upper ramps. I think that at the first stage of the open pit, the masonry level was brought to the entry point into the descending corridor. Then another inclined ramp was created, going to the center of the pyramid, and the masonry level was raised to its upper edge. Then the pit with the ramp was filled with blocks, while chambers and a descending corridor were built. The lower chambers began to work to deliver blocks along the second section of the ramp, and the third chamber was needed for the next section. Moreover, if we look at the plan of the rooms from above, we will see that the chambers are shifted relative to each other. For the first 2 chambers, this allowed for more convenient placement of the ropes. But the third chamber apparently had a section of the ramp shifted to the side. This assumption logically explains such a strange layout of the rooms. But then another important technique was used. The next section of the ramp went back to the surface of the pyramid, and the counterweight for it could be lowered directly along the edge. As you can see, the transition from step pyramids to pyramids with smooth edges, or the so-called true pyramids, was most likely not accidental either. It allowed the size of these structures to be significantly increased. And then came the time of the Kufu Pyramid. Its dimensions required serious changes in the construction sequence. Therefore, the chambers, and accordingly the pits with ramps in which they were created, were raised much higher than the ground surface. In addition, the builders abandoned the idea of vertical shafts above the chambers. Their dimensions were already too small for such a volume of construction. The type of ceiling was changed. A gable vault replaced the false vault, and the vertical shafts were built on the side, as I described in the 2 previous videos. And in the next part, we will continue to explore this pyramid, already keeping in mind the more complete picture that I just described to you. Of course, what I have just told you is a hypothesis, but it is based on a very important concept that connects many details of the Egyptian pyramids together. If it is true, then it turns out that there was nothing random in the pyramids at all, and almost all the details of this huge puzzle were thought out in advance by ancient architects. It becomes clear why the builders cut huge pits in the rocks, why inclined corridors were needed, why the chambers in the pyramids of the 4th dynasty were raised above ground level, and why there are several of them in the large pyramids. The strange, constantly changing location of these chambers and the choice of the type of ceiling for them receive a rational explanation. The transformations in the chambers of the bent pyramid, which seemed absolutely meaningless, become quite logical, as do many other incomprehensible details of the internal structure of the pyramids. Of course, all of these aspects require much more detailed study, and I think we are only at the beginning of the journey. At the end of one of the previous videos, I said that perhaps our journey to the time of the construction of the Great Pyramids is just beginning. Now I am sure of it. Dear friends, write in the comments what you think about the ideas presented in this video. And of course, if you liked the video, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much for your time and attention.